Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. Now, if you haven't listened to the previous two episodes of the show, I highly recommend you do that before listening to this one, and that's because this is part 3 of a 3-part special series recorded at London's world-famous Abbey Road Studios. My guests, as they were in the previous 2 episodes, are behavioural science gurus and friends of the show, Rory Sutherland, Gerald Ashley, and Paul Craven. Now, I say my conversation with, frankly, I don't say very much at all. I leave it all up to them, and I think that makes for a more exciting podcast. So you'll hear the 3 of them talking about a broad range of subjects. This time we've got addictive substances, why putting bus route details on the sides of buses increases the number of passengers, airline upgrade policies, and since we're at Abbey Road, I had to ask my guests for their top music recommendations, and what they came up with was a very interesting mix. Now, I should add that while we were recording in one studio at Abbey Road, just next door in Studio 2 was English rock band Def Leppard, who were recording their 13th studio album. Whether the Human Risk podcast will get to that esteemed number of recordings at Abbey Road is yet to be seen, but we'll have a go. With all of that said, I will leave you, as I did before, in the wonderful company of my fabulous guests, Gerald Ashley, Paul Craven, and Rory Sutherland, recorded at Abbey Road Studios.
One of the interesting things that strikes me, Paul Bloom, who's the Yale psychology professor, who does a very interesting interview on Econ Talk. One of his books is actually called, I think it's called Against Empathy. And there's a really vital question when someone's faced with a problem, okay, which is, do you want to actually solve this problem, or do you want to show that you care about it? Okay. If you want to show that you care, you will spend a lot of money tackling the problem head on.
Right.
Okay? Probably to solve the problem, you do the opposite. You actually spend less intervening obliquely and experimenting with oblique, kind of almost butterfly effect interventions. One of my ones, an example of that would be the idea that you simply reserve a certain number of university places for people aged 25 and over, and people who've paid tax can go to university for less if they've paid 5 years of tax. And the point of that is to stop it being a social norm that you go to university after you've left school.
Right.
And therefore, I'm not suggesting, by the way, the university has a value that, by the way, that isn't all about employability. People learning about French romantic poetry has a value, okay, of some kind. It's difficult to quantify, but if you love that, it's not an unhealthy thing to go and study it. But as you said, a lot of people are going to university without the faintest idea of why they're there. Now, if they worked for 5 years, they would have decided where they wanted to work, and they decided they want to become better at that. But also, it would just prevent this fact that people without a degree have a kind of weird sign above their head saying, not a graduate. Because what happened with a degree is it went from being, when I graduated in 1988, okay, having a degree was sufficient but not necessary to get a reasonable job.
Yeah.
Now it's actually necessary but not sufficient.
Exactly.
And there's a very big difference between those two states. Massive difference between those two states.
I think you just said something, also this desire to solve problems. We mustn't forget Shirky's principle, which is the idea of what you mustn't do is solve a problem that is your source of income.
Raison d'etre.
Yeah, and, I think until relatively recently, people who aren't as lazy as me can look up and find the precise dates. But there was the Council for the Resettlement of Refugees after the Second World War that certainly had an office well into the 1980s. Now, this was a bunch of course, French bureaucrats who have managed to work a really nice number, and they never quite came up with a reason to be put out of business.
The comedy sketch where they're in a cancer charity and the word comes through that someone's discovered the cure for cancer.
Disaster.
And they celebrate for about 5 minutes, and then suddenly panic takes hold. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the great one in finance was the most prized position in the city was not to sort of be chairman of Barclays or the governor of the Bank of England or Lloyd's or the Stock Exchange or anything like that, but to sit on Gordon Brown's committee for the 5 rules that needed to be in place before we could join the euro. And as everybody knew, those 5 rules were not compatible with one another. It was impossible for all 5 ducks to be lined up at one time. And so there was a huge rush of people who wanted to sit on this committee to meet and pontificate and be paid rather well,
Because they knew it was going to go on forever.
Yeah, and I suppose it wasn't perpetual, but it was near as damn it for quite a long time.
But it is interesting because the problem about wanting to signal that you care is that you may be driven to do things that are both expensive and ineffectual. Because, and so there are undoubtedly very, very neat solutions to problems, I think, that are out there that aren't actually, the reason they're not tried is not because there's any less likelihood of them working than anything else. It's simply because they're harder to justify. And the more bureaucratic a society comes, the more the quality of reasoning. I mean, if you take science, okay, we have to actually be quite critical about science or the scientific method, because if you look at p-values, they don't tell you anything about what you should do.
No.
Okay, so the likelihood that something is generalizably true, okay, doesn't really have that much bearing on what you should actually do. Let's say you have a drug that has miraculous effects in 10% of cases and mildly negative effects in 90% of cases. Well, should you try it? Okay. Now, you may say that, we trialed this drug and it was inconclusive. Okay.
Sure.
But actually, no. If you look at the data in a more nuanced way, which is less about your sense of certainty and more about consequences, okay, you wouldn't use this. I mean, a friend of mine put it very beautifully, which is that in some ways it actually prevents us from common sense, because I was pro-mask to begin with.
Yeah.
Okay. On the grounds that it seemed a lot more likely that they would help than that they would hinder. Now, okay, there wasn't actually any absolutely surefire evidence for this particular infection that they work. But as my friend who's a doctor said, look, there's no one's actually done a randomized control trial on whether builders should wear hard hats. Right? Okay. Because obviously it'd be extremely unethical. Okay, the 10% of you have to go around your work naked, okay, in the buildings. So we can actually be, we can be confident that metal toe cap hard. And there are cases where the requirement for certainty of data, okay, particularly if that data is highly selective, by the way, doesn't really tell you what to do.
Doesn't this open up? Again, I think this is an area, Rory, you've looked at maybe more than Paul and I, though maybe Paul certainly more than I have. UK transport policy, in particular, the way we seem to run the railways, and I know you were involved in being a joint author of a book on, was it travel in general or just
it's
rail?
called Transport for Humans, yeah.
Transport for Humans. I mean, my experience of travelling around rail is pretty screwed up in the UK. This is Christian's star lot as well, because he's the big rail user across Europe here. But I mean, there are a number of things we should do. I mean, the ticketing system seems mad to me.
Yeah.
Well. I mean, but it's easier to leave it as it is, I presume.
Well, I mean, one of the questions I'd ask is, I don't understand why the taxpayer's paying for HS2, because you could pay for it through land value capture, okay?
Yeah.
So you just build 2 stations in between London and Birmingham, a station between Birmingham and Manchester, maybe 2. You buy 10 or 20,000 acres of agricultural land around those stations, okay? You give yourself planning permission to turn it into housing. Now, you've got a house somewhere north of London where there's a train that'll take you into London in about 20 minutes, okay? That land goes up in value just with the award of planning permission from about 4,000 an acre to about 2 million an acre, okay? You don't need that many acres to make 60 billion quid out of that. And so...
And you're capturing the economic value.
You are. You're absolutely. So this is basically how Singapore and Hong Kong work. I mean, the governments in Singapore and Hong Kong are property developers with a side gig in government.
Which is fine.
Which sounds
absolutely perfect.
Yeah. We need to extend the metro. We'll build a massive grade apartment block on top of the station with an elevator that goes down to the platform.
Yeah. And
He's just paid for the line.
This is exactly how the British Empire was built. The British Empire is an accidental empire. It's a bunch of trotter brothers who thought they could do a lot of dodgy overseas dealing, and they ended up with the East India Company and armies and all the rest of it. It certainly wasn't remotely planned.
No.
And again, maybe this is one of the problems, is that transport policy is overly planned. I mean, obviously we've got to have a plans of some sort, but it seems to be to the nth degree. And
well, if you require, for example, absolutely gold standard evidence before you act, and this happened in a conversation with a transport authority. I've long argued that, for example, in London, it's a gross mistake that buses on the front merely display the final destination. Okay? Because most people aren't interested in going to the final destination.
They don't even know where it is.
No, Clapton Ponds, right? I mean, the only reason I'd go there is to dispose of a corpse. And if you need to dispose of a corpse, public transport is absolutely useless. I don't know if you've noticed this. You need a Mark II Jag, basically, if you want to dispose of a corpse.
I was going to say, of all the things I've tried on a bus, taking my own corpse is not another corpse.
There's CCTV everywhere. You're bound to attract attention.
Bloody annoying, isn't it?
Right, okay. Absolutely hopeless, But anyway, someone then said, he said, I looked at the information. He said, after COVID, he said, we have a few bus lines where we do display the bus route on the side of the bus. Now, it comes at the loss of advertising revenue.
Right? Because you've got to have a rolling...
You've got to, etc. Okay? He said, it seemed to us fairly clear that those routes were holding up much better because you had a loss of commuter traffic. The commuters were people who knew the bus route.
Yeah.
But those buses were holding up better because non-commuters would go, ooh, that goes via St Pancras, I'll hop on. Okay?
Okay. You don't need to know all the stations on a tube line because you can see the whole tube map.
You can see the whole tube map.
Now, again, I can't keep off France because in Paris...
Direction Porte de Clignancourt. Absolutely. Yeah.
Malheureusement. And, yes. Again, where are all these places on the old medieval wall of Paris, and who cares about them?
No, so that again, eastbound, westbound, at least kind of makes sense with every other map you've looked at, whereas Direction Château de Vincennes is... So the interesting thing was, now, what happens now is that they're unable... Now, first of all, I said, there's a perfectly creative solution to that, which is you can keep the advertising revenue and have some sort of digital solution which just scrolls through the destination.
Yeah.
You could even use a short, okay. So you could actually say CHX for Charing Cross and people would at least be able to learn it.
Yeah.
But secondly, it was kind of the reason they couldn't then make that decision is because no one had to 3 decimal places the argument for value of revenue versus value of lost.
And it's easy to just leave it as it is.
And it's easy to leave it as it is. And so trying things, if the price of trying things is perfect advance evidence.
It's Keynes, isn't it? Back to that old point. Better to fail conventionally than succeed unconventionally.
And also his thing that many people would rather be precisely wrong than vaguely right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think this is the difference between really managing things and leading things. Nowadays, it's very fashionable for everybody to be a leader. I was watching a documentary where right across the army, everybody is encouraged to be a leader. Well, somebody should be following, hopefully, somewhere. But I think the point is that a lot of people in positions of running things, that's what they're doing. They run them. It's a managerial thing. They're not looking to expand their brief or to do new things. New things are not necessarily very welcome, to be honest.
No, and also there's also among finance people an extraordinary paranoia about what you might call revenue abstraction. So it's similar to Clay Christensen's idea of the innovator's dilemma, which is that the innovative product will have a detrimental effect on sales of the previous product.
Yeah.
It's rather like the IBM PC, which, very cleverly, Watson created the IBM PC division. Now, the guy who ran it died in a plane crash, rather tragically. But the guy who ran it actually worked at IBM and wore cowboy boots. Now, that's equivalent to being a punk inside IBM. But also, he deliberately based it in Boca Raton in Florida, which was a whole seaboard away from IBM HQ.
Yeah.
Because he said, if I don't do that, they're going to kill it.
Yeah.
Okay. And this business of that anything we do that's new will actually eat into our existing revenue. So, as a consequence, okay, newspapers won't really learn to really thrive until they abandon the exclusive reliance on subscription and move to micropayment paper articles. In fact, they'll make a lot more money that way. Mobile phone companies were forced to offer pay-as-you-go, okay? Because in places like Africa, people didn't have the credit worthiness or bank account that was necessary to have a mobile phone with a subscription. So grudgingly, they offered pay-as-you-go, and then discovered a lot of people on pay-as-you-go spent more than the people did on subscription. Now, similarly, there's a kind of mentality which says, if we open a McDonald's drive-through window, all that will happen is we'll lose revenue from the restaurant. What you nearly always find in reality is that when you offer more ways of buying a thing, your sales go up.
Yeah, the pie gets bigger.
I had
the pie gets bigger.
A famous airline, which I will mention, but I had this row with them, which was slightly. British Airways used to do that thing where you turned up with a business class ticket and you said, anything going in the way of an upgrade, and they go, well, actually, you can upgrade to first for sort of 350 quid, you see. And you go, oh, fuck it. Yeah, go on, And, the thought of the teapot and and so forth just swayed you. Now, they stopped doing that because they were terrified of the idea that first-class ticket holders were gaming the system by buying a business-class ticket. Now,
round tripping, literally.
Now, actually, that probably happened to a small degree. Do you really think, though, that Tom Cruise is going to go, no, I won't pay for the full fare first-class ticket? On the off chance. I'm going to try and blag it. The people who are paying full fare first want to know that they're turning up at that airport and they're going to be in first no matter what, okay? Now, it was basically incremental revenue for not very much cost.
Yeah.
Okay? And yet, it's a bit like hotels going, no, we can't offer an upgrade to a suite because, bridal couples will just try and book the cheapest.
Any moment now.
We've actually just got married. Any chance of an upgrade to the bridal suite? It's not how the mind works. And in railways, any experimentation with a new pricing system, okay, is basically killed by the finance people who can't afford one bad 6-month period of transition, even though the long-term prospects are much,
we're
much
stuck
better.
with this Victorian ticket pricing system based around a 5-day working week or
and
whatever.
then they introduced a 3, the flexible season ticket.
Yes.
What they completely missed about that is that part of the thing of flexible working is you actually travel in an hour later and you buy an off-peak day return, right? So a flexible season ticket that demands you travel on a peak train is actually quite bad VFM.
Yeah.
But they completely missed that. What they should have done is you can buy 10 off-peak day returns, okay? And if you want to upgrade it to a peak ticket, that's a tenner. If they'd done that, it would have worked really well. But instead, they do something stupid. And but that paranoia about the fact that anything that involves any change, which threatens our existing revenue streams, is perceived as a threat. The lovely one is, okay, I might call this the Argos effect. I knew a fantastic woman who was quite senior in Argos, and every time they introduced one of these new... And for foreign listeners, Argos is basically the British Amazon. Why it's not valued at like £200 billion, I have no idea. It now belongs to Sainsbury's. But I won't. It's again an idea that makes absolutely no sense, but is kind of brilliant. Okay, now what happened with Argos? Every time they introduced a new way of selling something, like click and collect, text and reserve, okay, they got this massive pushback, which is that all you're doing is enabling people at our cost to buy things in a different way that they would have bought anyway.
Right.
The fundamental misunderstanding of psychology, which I think comes from mainstream economics, which is that people know what they want in advance. Okay. Actually, real innovation now, I think, should be 50% around pricing. Now, everybody takes the piss out of Blockbuster Video because they didn't buy Netflix for $50 million. Actually, when Netflix offered themselves to Blockbuster for $50 million, okay, they hadn't come up with that. Have 3 discs at any one time, $15 a month, replace them as often as you like, no late fees ever. They hadn't come up with that idea. They were just basically DVD rental by post.
Yeah.
So there's no reason to pay $50 million for them, in fairness to poor old Blockbuster. who always gets, it's a bit like the Beatles. We're here at Abbey Road. I mean, the Beatles were turned down famously by Decca, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, actually, if you listen to the tracks they played, they were shit.
Now
you'll be hit by lightning in this place.
You've now just committed the most appalling sin by saying
But the other interesting one was the finance people also had a say in turning down the Beatles, because the Beatles had come from Liverpool, okay, and the record company chose to sign Brian Poole and the Tremolos instead, because they lived in Dagenham or somewhere, or Dartford. And therefore they could come in on the tube, whereas every time you wanted to beat the Beatles, you'd have to pay for a turn round. I think that's quite short-sighted, isn't it, looking
it's
back?
bad news for rock bands in the Shetland Islands.
It is. Funnily enough, of course, Brian Poole and the Tremolos got a #1 before the Beatles did, I think. So the decision wasn't totally...
I think we're in very obscure waters now.
Oh, sorry, okay. But no, it's a classic case in decision science, which is you look at decisions that had bad consequences and assume they were bad decisions. Actually, they quite often weren't. They were good decisions.
No, you should revisit. You should certainly revisit all your bad decisions, and that's something else we don't do because
of confirmation bias.
I think also decisions. It's a bit like when you lose your set of keys. You hunt around for it. You hunt around it. And the moment you've got it, obviously you stop doing it. And I think people find a business solution or a solution to a particular problem, and then they stop.
Or they find an argument that makes sense, and they stop looking. The dishwasher is there to clean your plates and knives.
Yes.
Okay, perfectly sensible. Okay, move along now, nothing to see here. Actually, 50% of the value, as I said, is it keeps dirty plates out of sight.
Yeah.
And having two dishwashers is probably the greatest thing you can do in your kitchen.
We should have a separate program about two dishwashers.
Also, this is for that rare group of people who don't have staff to do it, I presume. Now you're talking about dishwashers.
What about just only because it just adds some elements of what we talked about, but conspiracy theories, because the world of social media and the world of about the left and the right brain, and it's an easy solution for some people. And we're in Abbey Road, so the conspiracy theory is that Paul is dead, which sort of came about, I think, 1969 when this album was being recorded, and then when the famous picture came out of them walking across the zebra crossing. Lots of clues in that for those that wanted to believe it. And the more the Beatles denied it, and the more Paul said, no, I'm fine, the more they thought it was someone else who'd replaced him in 1966, and it was someone else. And it was interesting because, just if you look at that photograph of them crossing the road, Paul's holding a cigarette in his hand. That's apparently very bad. John's wearing a white suit. That means he's the preacher. Ringo's in black. He's the undertaker. Apparently George is in denim. He must be digging the grave. And, of course, Paul is barefoot as well, so he must be dead. I mean, it's just extraordinary to me the way that people can be so adamant and certain in their confirmation bias, and they'll ignore and discount anything that says you're wrong.
Isn't it normally naivety? People who my experience, limited of life, is it's a cock up. It's not a conspiracy.
Well, this is an interesting one because if you look at, I think, the very poor record of science in being willing to consider the lab leak COVID theory.
Yes.
Which was hardly implausible. Okay, now just to be clear, the Wuhan Institute of Virology wasn't your friendly local virology institute. It's not like McDonald's with branches in every city. Right? It was China's central place for the research into batshit coronaviruses.
No.
Okay, you at least should say, well, first of all, that's plausible. Okay, it does seem an odd coincidence which we ought to investigate. If everybody in Porton Downs suddenly started growing two hairs, we wouldn't say, no, it's obviously, you're absurd to attribute this to the nearby biological research establishment. Okay, because you don't have a biological research establishment in every town, right?
Not that you know.
No, exactly. That's true. Actually, what that is, very, very few people actually were saying it was a conspiracy. They were saying it was a cock-up cover-up.
Yeah, yeah.
And the cock-up cover-up strikes me as very believable because it's not difficult to find a large group of people who need.
But if you said that, Rory, in 2020 on, you were vilified.
Yes,
you were vilified for saying that pretty early on.
Well, this is an interesting question about science, and I think I might raise this now, which is, the famous phrase about that it's attributed to the wife of the Bishop of Truro and various other people about Darwin's theory of evolution. Let us hope that it is not true. But if it is true, let us hope that it not be widely known. Okay. And there is undoubtedly a huge bias in science in that they publish things they want people to know, and they don't publish things they don't. Now, here's a case which I have not revealed this or ever mentioned this in a public forum, okay? But I think I can now, which is when I think it was Doll did his research into the link between smoking and lung cancer.
Richard Doll.
Richard Doll.
Yeah.
Interestingly, he actually discovered two things. Okay, one of which was that the link was absolutely statistically enormous. Okay, and that people who smoked were inordinately more likely to get, multiple thousands of times more likely to get,
orders of magnitude
more likely to get lung cancer. Not that people who didn't smoke couldn't get it, by the way. Very important to say, but that they were much, much more likely to get lung cancer. That is now fairly widely promulgated and known. There was another finding, which is if you quit smoking before you're 35, your life expectancy is pretty much unaffected. Now, no one knows that because they don't want you to know that. Now, the reason I'm saying it now, and I think I'm right in saying it now, but I might be wrong. Obviously, they don't want people to know that because teens will use it as an argument against their parents or anybody else to go, well, you can tell me to stop smoking, Gramps, but I've got 25, I've got 20 years left, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I think there's another finding which never also gets revealed, which is that obviously it's dose dependent. That 5-a-day smokers are much less at risk than 60-a-day smokers. In some way. I think there is a hockey stick.
Yeah.
When you hit 40 a day, it really hockey sticks up.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I mention all these things is that as an ad guy, obviously I've worked on anti-smoking and pro-vaping campaigns. I understand why they kept that 35 funding pretty quiet, okay? Because, however, you might say now it's easier to quit by switching to vaping. We should let it be more widely known because actually it's smokers over 35 should be our new target audience, okay? And smokers who smoke 40 a day should be a really, really heavy target. I mean, there's probably a case for, individual one-on-one intervention. In the case of over 35 smokers smoking 40 a day.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a parallel at the moment, and others may correct me, but to me it seems to be a story that's gone away. 10 years ago, mobile phones and incidents of brain cancer was the big
massive,
one.
Wasn't it? It was
massive. I haven't heard anything on that for years.
Yeah.
Has it been put to sleep as an idea? Has it been suppressed, or is it genuine, or is it all nonsense? But it was a big story for 2 or 3 years, and people said, I'm really worried about putting my phone against my head and all this sort of stuff.
My assumption is, and this is a guess, that because they haven't noticed any incidents in terms of people's proximity to masts, which are more powerful than a broadcasting continuous.
Yeah, it's like having your own personal microwave, isn't it?
So they have therefore concluded, possibly or possibly not safely, that there's no risk from the
It also, Gerald, doesn't make a headline, does it? A huge study concludes that this is safe.
Yeah.
But they'll do that with alcohol, by the way. They love the idea of alcohol.
There's another one that was like massive and then just disappeared. A huge fuss, and this may be 20 years ago. Irradiated food. Do you remember irradiated? Oh, I'm not touching these strawberries. They've been irradiated. Well, most people couldn't spell it, let alone explain what it is. And, people are absolutely adamant in these sort of vox pop interviews. Again, are we eating everything irradiated and we don't even know?
Actually, there's another thing, which is if you take the opposite direction, which is I'm driving into the Holland Tunnel in New York last summer. And I wind
Through
down,
it.
Okay. I wind down the window. There's a massive smell of dope.
Oh,
if you go out in London on Saturday night, the smell of dope is everywhere.
Top travel tip.
Okay. I mean, anyway, one of the interesting things is I look over to see who is generating this massive dope. And it's the driver of the car alongside, right? Not the passenger, but the driver. Now, we seem to have come to the conclusion that dope has gone from, in our student days, to being, particularly an expellable offence if you were at Cambridge in the 1980s, okay? I think if you got caught with cannabis, there would be a considerable risk.
Big Stewart's inquiry.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. To being just basically accepted as, Now, here's an interesting question, okay? Let's look at different drugs for a bit. On average, okay, I think alcohol is beneficial, probably. More people derive pleasure from it in one way or another. I don't know, because the externalities are actually terrible.
The Churchill quote, I've got more out of alcohol than it has out of me.
And for a lot of people, that's probably true, okay?
Yeah.
If you are seriously addicted to alcohol, it's catastrophic in a way that actually smoking certainly isn't. Now, there's a reason to ban a drug, not only because a drug doesn't have to be bad on average for you to ban it necessarily, okay? It's simply so deleterious to the well-being of 5% of people that you discourage its use more widely, because you don't want these 5% of people come into contact with it. People who might be victims of psychosis or anything else.
Yeah.
Now, if you think about asymmetry of perception, most middle-class people like us only come across dope smokers who are in the successful category, because if they're driven to psychosis, we probably don't come across them very much. Right?
Not socially acceptable, really.
It's not really psychosis. It tends to get you disinvited from the... Okay. Now, if you talk to someone like Jess Phillips, the Labour MP for somewhere in Birmingham, who has family experience of family members who've had catastrophic effects from cannabis, particularly the very strong kinds, which now seem to be prevailing, okay, they're not nearly so sanguine about this kind of liberalisation.
No.
Okay. But the second thing is, okay, salt is an interesting one, because we discourage salt. Now, most people, their health isn't adversely affected by salt. There's a percentage of people, I don't know if it's 5%, 8%, whatever, but there's a percentage of people whose bodies just don't really compensate for the blood pressure effect of ingesting salt. But we tell everybody to avoid salt in order to improve the health of this group of people. Now, in a perfect world, we'd find out who those people were. We'd tell everybody else, eat as much salt as you like because it tastes fucking great. And the 8% of people would go on a really low salt diet, a bit like people who are celiac don't eat gluten, right?
Yeah.
But if there's no way of identifying in advance who has these really deleterious effects from alcohol and gambling, I think, are much worse than smoking, in that smoking is generally bad for quite a lot of smokers, but in a kind of way that's, the negative externalities aren't that. Okay, put it this way. If you're an unborn fetus, right, and you had the choice, you can be born into a household where the dad's a heavy smoker, a heavy drinker, or a heavy gambler. You'd choose the smoker, I think. You probably would, okay?
Hell of a choice.
I know some kids whose father was a professional gambler, and they said the worst part of it was Christmas, where you didn't know whether you were going to get a 1-in-2 scale model Ferrari or some string. Depending on how things had gone in the previous week, you had no idea what your Christmas present was going to be like, you know. But I mean, you know, in terms of externalities, smoking's actually quite low. Okay, in terms of the effect on. If no one said, I can't go into town this evening because there are a load of people there who've had 20 pence in their hedges and they're going to beat me up and key my car, right? By the way, I'd say the externalities of cannabis in that way are mostly actually pretty benign, okay? I mean, stoned people are nicer than drunk people, generally. My friend who did the Isle of Wight festivals, Ray Fowke, always said that, you know, if the Isle of Wight festivals had run on booze, not dope, it would have turned into kind of Altamont.
Yeah,
you know, it would have turned really, really
yeah.
nasty. Whereas in the event, they had very, very few instances of violence. So there are a lot of positives to it. I'm not disputing that. But nonetheless, I don't think it's safe to say I know a lot of people who benefit from this or are not adversely affected. Therefore, banning it is wrong, because there are pro-social arguments.
We seem to be in a world where either it's just sold to us or we seek it out, where people want endless guidance on whether you should eat more tomatoes or less tomatoes, or, you know, you should run 5K a day, it's pointless running, you're just going to kill your ankles, or whatever it may be. There's this constant stream of
quantification of...
Yes. They want to quantify everything. They want certainty. They can't accept the idea of randomness. That's another thing that human brains... And the media are throwing binary options at everybody, so there's no nuance. That I think is my big takeaway from a lot of this conversation is people aren't willing to look beyond the obvious straight answer that's the conventional answer.
This is the right brain left brain distinction again, isn't it? Which is the left brain only knows what it knows, and it has a kind of confidence because of that, because it doesn't have to inject contradictory or conflicting information.
It knows the right answer.
Whereas the right brain is highly contextually sensitive, you know. So, I mean, one case of left-brainism is demanding the same political correctness of comedy than you do of a working environment, right? Because my argument is, look, if you go to a comedy club and complain that you're offended, that's a bit like going to a boxing club and complaining because you get punched in the face. It's kind of the point, right?
But Rory, I mean, if you listen to the Ian McGilchrist argument, and again, I'd recommend any of our listeners to listen to his podcast, he looks back with a broad sort of history going back to ancient Greece and looks at different civilizations and says this is how civilizations rise when they're using a balance of both sides of the hemisphere. And as he's not saying right is better than he's saying you need them both. He said, but as civilizations grow and grow and grow, they become more and more left hemisphere orientated and they collapse. And he thinks that we're in exactly that position now. He's very pessimistic. And I hate to be pessimistic.
I think he might be right, yeah.
We don't have another hour, but this is Peter Turchin territory as well.
Interesting.
But we'll have to come back. Can we go to Muscle Shoals in Alabama next time and do a Stones recording?
We absolutely can do that. And I think this is probably the perfect moment to bring this episode home. But before I do that, given we are at Abbey Road, I think it'd be a good idea just to get your one musical recommendation, the one song or album that you would recommend to listen to. Paul?
Bob Dylan, who didn't record here at Abbey Road, an album that not many people know about called Oh Mercy.
New to me. Again, Heresy, as we're in Homeland of the Beatles. Exile on Main Street by the Rolling Stones. Double album, twice the fun.
And actually, I recommend YouTube. In fact, I recommend YouTube for everything. And I'm trying to campaign for the BBC part of the license fee to go to give just the whole of the UK YouTube Premium. Because it's so valuable. YouTube has gone from being, something you'd watch on your mobile phone occasionally with appalling picture quality to being effectively Wikipedia with movies. Okay. I mean, you can search for anything there and find something of interest. It of all the things that I think is an unalloyed good about the internet, I think it's that. And there's a recording here of the Seekers singing I Know I'll Never Find Another You, being recorded in the studio next door, which is particularly wonderful. Now, I know it's not a fashionable band. I think one of the sad things about music is that we've lost contact with folk in any shape or form, actually. And there's an additional reason I like it, which is that Judith Durham and the guy with the big specs who plays the double bass met in the reception of J. Walsh Thompson in Melbourne.
Wasn't he? He was an advertiser.
They were both, I think
they were both in
been.
advertising.
Yeah.
One of them went back to advertising. The man with specs.
You're absolutely right. He did indeed. Yeah. Wow. And actually, they also wrote, of course, the Coke song, which is that was their creation as well, which I'd like to teach the world to sing. Which I imagine might well have been recorded here, but I need to find that out.
Paul McCartney, John Lennon, Ringo Starr, George Harrison, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. The end.
Wow. Gentlemen, I've said virtually nothing on this show, which makes it the best episode ever.
It's been a complete waste of time. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for your time and wonderful insights.
Thank you.
So that's it for this 3-part special recorded London's world-famous Abbey Road Studios. My enormous thanks to friends of the show who've appeared numerous times before. You'll find links to that in the show notes. Gerald, Ashley, Paul Craven and Rory Sutherland for some incredibly stimulating and fascinating conversations. It's always a pleasure to have them on the show, and maybe I'll follow up on that idea of taking them to another music studio somewhere in the world. If you're not already subscribed to the Human Risk podcast, you can do that wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To catch up on previous episodes that you might have missed, visit humanriskpodcast.com and you'll find links to those there. I've also put links to the previous episodes featuring Gerald, Paul and Rory in the show notes, so they're easy for you to find. Of course, I can't let the episode end without a cheap plug for my book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioural Science to Ethics and Compliance. There's a link to that in the show notes, and you can get access to the first few chapters for free. I really hope you enjoyed this 3-part series. If you did, please do leave a review wherever you download your podcast. It really does help spread the word of the show and allows me to continue to attract high-quality guests. Thank you so much for listening. My name's Christian Hunt. I'll see you very soon for another episode of the Human Risk podcast. But in the meantime, stay safe and enjoy your music.